Now, as I emphasized in the last lecture, props are super important. We use them for something which is also called parent-child communication. So the parent component or app, in this case our main app, communicates to its child HTML element, to its child component, in this case to the friend contact component. The friend contact component is a child of this app because we use it in the template of the app. On the other hand, for friend contact, the app would be the parent because, well, friend contact gets used in the template of app. So these are just terms you can keep in mind, parent and child, and we use props to communicate from the parent to the child. So to pass data from the parent to the child component, from app to friend contact in our case. Now here's one important thing you have to know about props and which you should keep in mind. Props typically should not be mutated. And what do I mean by that? Let's add a new prop. Let's say here in app.view, we have a isFavorite prop, which we pass to friend contact. And the value I pass here is 1 for true or 0 for false. So here I pass isFavorite, and here let's say I set this to 0. Now that's a new prop, which we therefore should add here in friend contact. isFavorite written like this. Now we got this isFavorite prop. Now let's say we want to use that to output some extra information after the name. Here with interpolation, I'm checking if isFavorite is equal to 1. And if that's the case, I'll output some extra text here, otherwise I won't. And the extra text is a pair of parentheses where I say favorite. If I now save that and reload, you see favorite after Manuel Lawrence, because that is where I added isFavorite. And after Julie Jones, we don't see that because there I set isFavorite to 0. Now, why am I doing that? Well, let's also see we have another button here which allows us to change the favorite status. I'll say toggle favorite on the button. And I'll add a new method, toggle favorite could be the name, to which I want to point here with the click listener on that button. And now we add this method here in the methods, toggle favorite. And in here, I'll check if this isFavorite is equal to 1. So if we were a favorite, in which case I'll set it to 0. And otherwise, if isFavorite was 0, I'll set it to 1. We could do this to change the favorite status with help of the button. If we save that, we get an error here. The error is unexpected mutation of isFavorite prop. As I mentioned, that's not something you should do. Now, why should you not do that? Because Vue uses a concept which is called unidirectional data flow. Now, that's again a fancy term, but it means one simple thing. Data passed from app to friend contact should only be changed in app, not in friend contact. We just pass data down to friend contact, and once the data is passed down, friend contact cannot change the data we manage in app view, at least not by simply changing the received data. So if we change data inside of friend contact, like here when I try to change isFavorite, this is not allowed by Vue because we violate this pattern of having a unidirectional data flow. Now, if we want to change this, there are two ways of doing that. The first way of doing it is that we let the parent know that we'd like to change this. Then the parent can go ahead and change the data in itself and pass the updated data back to friend contact. That's a pattern we'll explore later. It's an important pattern and we'll therefore have a detailed look at it soon. The other approach is that we simply take the received data as the initial data inside of friend contact, and then we change that data inside of friend contact, but we are aware of the fact that we only change it there and that this won't affect the data in app.view. To implement this pattern, all we need to do is we need to add a new data property in our component. For example, friend is favorite, so using a different name than I used here. And now set this equal to this is favorite, so set it equal to the received prop value. Then we use the received prop value just as an initial value for friend is favorite. And now friend is favorite can be used here, friend is favorite, in the template, but also in the rest of the code. And if we now change that friend is favorite property, that will be okay, because that's now a regular data property where the prop we received is just used to set an initial value. So now that works, and I can toggle this favorite status. I'm emphasizing this and talking about this because this unidirectional data flow is an important concept. Now, of course, you will have scenarios where you want to be able to change the original data you got from the app.view file. So where just using it as initial data and then changing it internally is not enough. Therefore, we'll also very soon have a look at how you can implement that. For the moment, be aware that you should not mutate props, but if you need to do it, you can just take a prop as an initial value and then change the component exclusive property instead. So props are important, as you can tell, and thus far we're specifying props like this, as an array of the props we expect to get, where every prop is just added as a string. I mentioned that this would be the bare minimum configuration. With that, you let Vue know about the props you expect to get, but you don't provide any other information to Vue. This is okay, especially for simple apps or simple components, but for more complex components, and especially when working in a team, for example, you might want to share more information about your props. Simply so that Vue can let you know if you pass incorrect data to a component or if you forgot some required prop. And for that, you can replace this array of props. Actually, I'll copy it and comment it out so that we still have it for reference. You can replace it with an object. And in that object, you now have your props as JavaScript property names and then certain values for them. And here, the most basic extra information you could provide is the type of data you expect to get. For example, string. To make it clear that the value of the name prop should be a string. And if instead a number would be provided, we would get an error. Side note, I'm speaking of a number type being provided, not text that contains a number. That would of course be okay since it would be a string. So we can do that instead, and now make it clear that all our data at the moment at least is getting a string, like this. So now we're saying that this component will get a name, a phone number, an email address, and a isFavorite prop, and every prop should get a value of type string. And hence, this of course works, but now we provide more information. But you can be even more detailed than that. Instead of just providing that type here, you can provide an object as a value for the prop you're expecting to get. And in this object, you now can add a type property, which holds the type of that prop you want to get, but you can also add more properties. Now, not any properties of your choice, instead specific properties Vue will look for. For example, type, but also required, to indicate whether this prop, the name prop here, should be required or not. And this should be true or false. So here we could make it clear that this component, the friend contact component, needs a name prop. This is required. And we can do the same, of course, for the other props. Type string and the phone number is also required. And also for the email address. We want to get a string and it is required. Now, let's say the isFavorite prop is also of type string, but it's not required. In that case, if you have a non-required prop, you can add a default key, where you provide a default value which will be used if the prop should be missing. So here, for example, 0, so that by default, this component is not a favorite. Default can also be a function, by the way, where you could have a more complex code snippet that executes to derive the default. But here I'll just set this to 0 as a string. You can also add a validator, which holds a function which should return true or false. This validator function will get the value provided for the prop, and then you can have any validation logic of your choice to find out whether that's a valid value or not. So here for isFavorite, for example, we could check if value is equal to 1 or if value is equal to 0, and that will therefore yield true if either of the two is correct, or false if we get a totally different value. So with that, we could make sure that really only the values 1 and 0 are allowed here. And what's the whole idea behind that? Well, with that more detailed configuration here, we can go to the place where we use our component and, for example, omit isFavorite, let's say on the second component here, on Jolie. With that, the app still works because we made this prop isFavorite non-required. It's optional. We have a default fallback value. On the other hand, if I remove the name here and save that, we don't get an error here. But if we open up the developer tools and the JavaScript console there, we get a warning by Vue that we got a missing required prop name. And that helps us as a developer to spot such mistake quicker during development. And we don't have to guess why the component now is not working anymore. Instead, we get a clear warning. So that's very useful. Hence, let's bring back that name. If I provide an invalid value for isFavorite, for example, we got the invalid prop warning because our custom validator check failed. We didn't provide 1 or 0, but instead 100, which is simply not valid as specified here. So you can have more complex prop definitions to make sure that your component really gets used correctly. Now, ultimately, of course, it's your component, so it's up to you how detailed you want to be. If you have an entire project on which you work on your own, you might not need those more detailed configurations because you know all your components and all your props anyways. But if you're sharing your component with other people as a third-party package, or because you're working in a team, you might want to provide such more detailed prop definitions so that everyone who's using your component is quickly able to see how that component works, which data it needs, and when a prop is valid or not valid. Getting such extra warnings here can then really be helpful and make your life as a developer much, much easier. And that's the idea behind more complex prop definitions and prop validations, which I showed you here. Now, for the majority of the course, I will use the simpler types of definitions, either this array or just defining the value type. But I want you to be aware of that so that if you are working in a bigger project, you do know how to be more explicit regarding your props and how they should look like. Now, of course, props cannot just be set to string values. And of course, just like other HTML elements, you can bind them to dynamic values. For example, isFavorite currently works with 1 or 0. Now, since we have exactly 2 values, it would make much more sense that we want a boolean here, so that we make it clear that this should be of type boolean. Then we can also get rid of that validator because a boolean can only be true or false. There are no other values. The default value then could be false here, so that isFavorite is false by default. But now to pass false, we can't just set this to true or false here. This is not how it works because this will always be some text here. Instead, to use the true value type, we need to bind this with vbind. And that is something we can do. We can bind our own props just as we can bind any other HTML attribute. And if we got a prop that needs a JavaScript value other than a string, then we need to use vbind or the shorthand, of course, to pass in that value. You can, of course, still also execute any JavaScript expression here, call a method, or whatever you want to do, but you can also use that to pass non-string values. But being able to bind props dynamically is not just useful for that. It's not just useful to pass non-string values, even though that is useful. But it's also useful to make those components a bit more dynamic. Maybe you forgot about it already, but we have our friends here in an array inside of our app.view file. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could use v4 again, but now repeat our own component and then pass in the different data for each loop iteration? Well, turns out you can do that. You can use v4 and also vif, by the way, on your own components, just as you can use it on default HTML elements. So here, I can loop through my friends like this. And now there's just one important rule. You always need to add a key here. I talked about the key before. Keys are important when you deal with v4. When you use v4 on a custom component, adding a key is mandatory. So make sure you add the key prop here. You don't need to specify it in your component. Vue automatically knows what to do with it. Make sure you use it when you use v4 on a custom component. And then here we can bind key dynamically to friend.id, for example. And now we can not just bind key dynamically, but also all the other fields, like name. Here, we can set this equal to friend.name. Phone number. We can set this equal to friend.phone, because that is the field we have here where we store our dummy phone number. And the same, of course, also for email address. Bind it dynamically to friend.email. And for the moment, I'll leave isFavorite as it is. We'll work on that again later. Now we can remove that second usage of friend contact, because now v4 will create multiple friend contact elements on this page, one for every friend in Friends. And we're binding all prop values dynamically to pass in the different data we have for every friend. This, of course, also means that we now can get rid of that dummy friend we're defining in friendContact.view. We don't need that anymore, because we already are receiving all the prop data we need from outside. And we can also change toggle favorite. Since isFavorite is now a boolean by default, we no longer should check if it's 1 or 0. We can simplify this and set this friend is favorite equal to what it's currently not, to toggle it like this, and set it to true if it was false and false if it was true. And with all of that, if we now go back, you now see your different data still, but now in two components that are created with v4. Now, toggle favorite is not working here. Let's see why that is the case. Yeah, because this check, of course, is wrong. Since it's a boolean, we should check if it's true or false like this. So if I now adjust this, that now looks better. Now, at the moment, both are favorites because I set isFavorite to true here on the friend contact component in general. So for every iteration, we create a new friend contact, but it always has isFavorite set to true. But that is something we'll take care about later. The key takeaway here is that we can use v4, that we can bind those props to dynamic values, and that now we got an even more reusable component, hopefully making it clearer and clearer why components are that amazing. So that's it for props for the moment. We're using props to pass data from the app.view file into our friend contact component. Now, what about communication from the component to the parent? A good example would be toggle favorite. At the moment, this is kind of a dummy thing. I'm setting it to true for every generated friend, and we're not really managing it on a friend-specific level. Yes, I can toggle it for an individual friend, but that only changes inside of the component. In reality, just like the name, the phone number, the email address, isFavorite should not be set to true like this. Instead, we should probably have a isFavorite property on our friend objects, so that this data is really stored on the input data where we have the rest of our friend data as well. So we could have isFavorite here and also here. That's what we typically would want to do, because the information whether a friend is a favorite of us or not is just as important and friend specific as its phone number and email address. And it's not just something which we want to change here inside of a component, it should be part of our core friend data, which could be coming from a database or anything like that. Now we got isFavorite managed here, and of course we can pass that down to our component, but there again it just acts as an initial prop value. Which means if I click toggle favorite here, that changes it inside of the friend contact component, but not inside of our core friend data. Here, of course, that is just some dummy data, but if this would be coming from a database, we probably would want to send it back to that database as well. So just changing it inside of that component is not enough. We would also want to change it here in app.view file in our friends data, in our friends array. So therefore, we now need communication from the friend contact component back to app.view. So basically the opposite of props. Props allowed us to pass data from app.view to friend contact. Now we need a way of letting friend contact tell app.view that the favorite status changed. And how could that work? How could we implement that? Well, how does it work for regular HTML elements? If we click a button, the button in the end wants to let us know that it was clicked. So the button emits a click event to which we can listen. And it's the same for custom components in Vue. If a component should talk to its parent and let the parent know that something happened, that component should emit an event to which the parent can listen. And indeed, you can emit your own custom events inside of your Vue components. For example, here, when toggle favorite is triggered. In this method, instead of changing this internal friend is favorite data property, we can use this and now a built-in method which ships together with Vue, and therefore it starts with a $sign, just like refs did in the behind the scenes module. But now it's not refs, but emit, $emit. That's a built-in method which you can call from inside a Vue component on the this keyword. And this allows you to emit your own custom event to which you then can listen from inside the parent component. Now, emit wants at least one argument, and that is the name of the custom event. And here you can name this event however you want. It's your event, so you can use any name you want. And I'll use toggle-favorite. Here, the convention is to always use cap-uppercase, no matter where you use it. So that's different to props, where in the component that receives it, you use camel case, and you only use cap-uppercase for passing in the values. For events, it's always cap-uppercase. So now we're emitting this toggle favorite event. Our own component is emitting this custom event. And what do you do with that? Well, you listen to it just as you can listen to clicks on buttons. In the app.view file, where we use our own component, you can listen to it with v-on or the @ shorthand. And here we can listen to toggle-favorite and bind this to any JavaScript code that should execute when this event is emitted. So here we could now add methods to our Vue app config object and add a method named toggle favorite status, for example, and then bind this method here to our toggle favorite event. And if we save that, that should work. Of course, at the moment it does nothing, but we also don't get an error. And we can tell that it works if we add an alert here in that toggle favorite status method. This works, which of course is not the final code, but a good test. Now you see I get this alert if I click toggle favorite. And that is how we can communicate back from a component to its parent. But of course we're not done. We're now emitting a custom event, but this event should probably carry some data so that we also let the parent, the app.view file, know which of the two contacts changed its favorite status. Because we got two, and here we got no easy way of telling. Well, in friendContact.view, when we emit, we can also pass a second argument. Actually, you can pass as many arguments as you want, and every extra argument will simply be data that you pass together with your event. So for example here, we could expect that we get one extra prop, the ID of the friend, which is of type string and which should be required. So I'm adding this extra prop definition. In app.view, we do have IDs, so we can easily pass them in simply by binding the newly defined ID prop and passing in friend.id like this. And now with the ID provided to friend contact on the ID prop, we can emit it here with our custom event. This ID is now available because I just added a prop named ID to this component. And now the toggle favorite event, when it's emitted, will carry this as an extra data. And that will then be provided as a first argument to a method that listens to this event. So in app.view, we're pointing at the toggle favorite status method on our own event. And the toggle favorite status method, therefore, will now receive this friend ID. You can name this argument however you want here, but you will get this second argument we're providing here when we're emitting the custom event. This ID is accepted here as a first parameter in toggle favorite status. And this now helps us identify the friend where we want to change the favorite status. So now we can reach out to our friends array and use the built-in find method which exists in JavaScript to find a friend where friend ID is equal to the friend ID we're getting here. And that's default JavaScript code for finding that friend object in the friends array where the ID property holds the same value as the friend ID argument we're getting here. This is then the identified friend, we could name it. And on that identified friend, we can now set isFavorite to what it's currently not. And this will change that data. And the cool thing is, when that data changes, Vue will detect this change and it will then automatically pass the updated favorite status back to the component and update the UI. So now we never change the favorite status inside of the friend contact component, but we always change it in the app.view file, and still you will see that everything works. The only change we'll need to make for that is back in friend contact. We now get rid of this friend is favorite data property we added there before. And instead we use our isFavorite prop, which we're getting and which we're now changing eventually in app.view. We're using this prop here in our template because that will now work. If we save that, you see I can toggle this and Vue detects all the changes and updates everything correctly. And now we're using this unidirectional data flow in both directions. We're using it to pass prop data from app.view into our component, but we're also using it the other way around to emit a custom event inside of our own component with the $emit method and listen to this custom event in app.view to then make changes to the data in app.view, which we're storing in the data property of our main app here, to then feed that updated data back into our component, where View will then see that something changed and where View then updates the UI. And this is how you work with components. You can emit your own events and you can set your own data. It's actually quite similar to working with default HTML elements, just with the difference that you now control the code behind the HTML element, so to say. So as you can clearly tell, custom events are important, an important feature for component communication. Now, just as with props, you can define them. You can let View know about the events your component will emit. For props, this is actually required. For events, it's recommended. Now, I'll just close this here to gain some space. The props are still there. I'm just collapsing this so that it takes up less space. And I'll add a new property to the friend contact configuration object. And that's the emits property. Now, emits, so to say, is the counterpart to props. In props, you define which props this component receives. In emits, you define which custom events your component will eventually at some point emit. And you're doing this to document your component, to make it obvious to other developers how your component works and to which events they can listen. This is simply useful. It makes it easier to understand your component. Because otherwise I have to look through all your code to see that there is some code where you emit toggle favorite. With emits, you would simply add toggle favorite here as a string to this array, and that would make it clear that there definitely is some code in your component which leads to an event with that identifier to be emitted. And you can also take emits to the next level. This is the basic form of using it, and it already helps with understanding your component. But just as with props, you can also specify an object instead, and then add your emitted events as keys here, like this, and then provide a more detailed configuration. The configuration you should then add is a function that receives the data which you eventually will emit as parameters. So in this case, we will eventually emit an ID. So here we would add ID as a parameter. And I'm doing that to make it obvious that toggle favorite is an event that should be handled by a function that expects an ID, because I will emit an ID here. You can then also add validation here to make sure that when the event is emitted, this data, which should be part of the event, is not forgotten. We can check if ID exists, if this is truthy, and return true if that's the case, and else return false. And maybe also issue a warning in the console that ID is missing to help developers that are emitting this event catch this error. And now, for example, if I remove this second argument here and I save that and I click toggle favorite, I get an error here. But before that error, I actually also get a warning: invalid event arguments, event validation failed for event toggle favorite, ID is missing. So this is something which you don't have to add, but which can make your life as a developer easier, especially again if you're working in a team. Now let's bring this ID back, and I will not add this detailed of a validation to the custom events throughout the course, but since it is the complete guide, I of course want to show this to you so that you know this feature. Nonetheless, I will revert this here and go back to this simpler definition, which is the approach I will use throughout the course, simply to make it obvious which custom events this component will eventually emit. I'm fully aware that this was a lot of new information about components, props, and events. The key takeaway, of course, is that props are there to send data into a component and events are there to send data out of a component, you could say. Now let's practice this together. You will later also have an assignment which you do on your own, but let's start together. And let's add a brand new component to this app and a brand new functionality as well. Because at the moment, our friends here are fairly static. We got an array with 2 friends, and yes, isFavorite is able to change, but we got no way of adding or deleting friends here. And that is a feature I'd like to add to this demo application. So therefore, we'll add a new component that allows us to enter the data for a new friend, so the name, the phone, and the email address, let's say, and then I want to be able to confirm that data, and that data should be added here. Now we could absolutely add this form here. Let's say below the header, we could add a form. And in here, we could then add our inputs like this. And we could then also add proper styling and make sure that we got all the input elements we need. And whenever data is entered and confirmed, we added this array of friends. This would work, but it is exactly not what you should do. Instead of having large view files with a lot of logic in there, you should have multiple, smaller, specialized components instead, and then build your UI by combining these components. So in reality, we would not add the form here, but instead in the components folder, we would add a new component. New friend could be the component name. So I'll name the file newFriend.view. And in there, we would add our template again and our script section. And we would create that form and handle the user input in this component and then just emit a custom event once everything is confirmed to the app.view file and pass all the entered data on to app.view. Now, definitely feel free to try this on your own. Here's your chance to pause the video and implement this on your own, but thereafter we'll do this step by step together to practice this component concept and also the props and the custom events concept. Nonetheless, if you want to try it on your own, here's your chance to pause the video. So, were you successful? Let's now try it together. In newFriend.view, I'll add a form, a default HTML element therefore, and in here I now want to have various inputs. So I'll add an input of type text for the name, and maybe also add a label where we say name. And then I will repeat that a couple of times here. I'll actually also put each label input set into a separate div to make it easier to tell them apart. So here we also have an input for the phone number then. And here we can set the type to tel because we want to get a telephone number here. And here we got the email address and we can set the type to email to get an email address. And that's all regular HTML. Below that, let's say we have another div, and in there we have our button where we say add contact. And since this button is inside of a form, when it's clicked, that form will be submitted. Now here in the script tags, I'll export a default JavaScript object which will hold the configuration for this component, but for the moment it's empty. We'll add more later. And in main.js, we can now import this component. We can import the new friend component from /components newFriend.view and register this as a component with app component. New-friend could be our custom HTML tag. Keep in mind that it should be a 2-word tag with a dash between the words. And new friend is our component configuration, even though it currently is an empty object. But the template will already be picked up. And therefore in app.view, here between header and unordered list, we can add our new friend component, opening and closing. And if we do that, we see our form here. Now the styling is not super beautiful, so I will tweak that a bit in the style tags in the app.view file. And in the end, I will just reuse the styling I used for list items. So here I will target the form element with that as well. And now we have this form. Now it's still not super pretty when it comes to the labels and the inputs. So for that, I'll quickly add some new styling, but I don't want to bore you with that. So attached you find a form.css file which contains these styles, which I'll add here. And now with these 3 styles added to the style tags, this is what you should see on the screen. So now this is our own component, a brand new form component, which allows us to enter data for the name, the phone number, and the email address, and then click Add Contact. So now for the logic. Which props do we need here? Well, I would say we need no props, because this component will gather some user data, and eventually it should provide that to app.view, but it doesn't really need any external data. So I don't see any props which we would need here at the moment. But as I just said, we'll definitely need to emit an event. And therefore I'll already add the emits property and add an event name of my choice here, or of your choice, of course, in your case. And I'll name it add-contact, because that's the kind of event we'll emit here. But you can also pick a different name, any name that makes sense to you. I will also add my data property here and manage some component-specific data. So data that is required by this component. And here essentially I want to store what the user enters as a name, as a phone number, and as an email address. And therefore I'll just add 3 data properties here. Entered name, which initially is an empty string, entered phone, which initially is an empty string, and you guessed it, entered email. And I will bind these data properties with vModel. So here vModel is bound to entered name. Here I'll bind the phone number input with vModel to entered phone, and the email with vModel to entered email, so that with every keystroke we store what the user enters. I'll also listen to the submit event on the form with @submit, and I will use the prevent modifier to ensure that when this is submitted, we prevent the browser default, which would lead to the page being reloaded, which is not what I want. I want to handle this fully inside the running Vue application. Here we can point at a method of our choice, and I'll name the method submitData. But again, it's your code, your method, you can name it however you want, but we do have to add that method, of course. So here, after data, we add methods to this new friend component config object, and there I'll add the submitData method, which now will be triggered when the form is submitted. And here I have one simple thing which I want to do. I want to emit my custom add-contact event so that I can forward that data to whoever is listening to that custom event, which later will be the app.view file. So here we use this $emit and then emit add-contact, so the custom event I'm announcing here, basically. And we forward this entered name, this entered phone, and this entered email. You could also group this together into an object and just emit one argument therefore, or like I'm doing it here, emit 3 arguments. And now we can go to app.view and listen to this custom event on the new friend component with add-contact, and then point at a method which we need to define here. And I'll name that method add-contact as well. But again, this name is up to you. It doesn't have to be the same one as we used for the event. These two don't have to be the same. So now down in methods, I'll add contact, and we expect 3 parameters here because we're emitting 3 pieces of data: the name, the phone number, the email. So here I expect to get name, phone, and email. These parameter names are up to you, but the order of course matters because it's the same order as specified here when we emit the event. And then here we can create a new friend contact, which should be a new JavaScript object, which now has the same structure as our dummy starting objects. So name, phone, and email, but also an ID and also a isFavorite property. Now we can generate a pseudo unique ID by, for example, using the current date, which we can get like this in JavaScript, and converting that to an ISO string so that we basically have a string that reflects the current timestamp, which is not perfectly unique, but unique enough for now. And then we can set our other data properties, like the name, which we set equal to the name we're getting here. So that's the property name in this object. This here, on the right side of the colon, is referring to the name argument we're getting. And I'm going to do the same here for phone and email. And that I picked the same names for the arguments as I did for the properties is a pure coincidence. You don't have to do that, of course. But the property names should be the same ones as in your dummy objects, because you're referring to those properties here when you're setting values for the props of the friend contact component. Now we also need the isFavorite property here, and let's say that's false as a default. Now we got that new friend contact, and now we can reach out to this friends, so to our friends data property, which we have in our app config object here. So reach out to this friends and push the new friend contact here, this newly created object. And with all of that in place, if we save that, I should be able to enter a new contact here, click add contact, and here he is. Here's Max with the data I just entered, working like the other components. So that's now working. We're able to add our own contact, and we're doing that with help of a new component, the new friend component, which also is using custom events. Now, as I mentioned before, I also want to be able to delete friends. And for that, let's say in the friend contact.view component, I will add a third button besides the other buttons which we already have. Let's say below this list which we have in every friend contact item. There, I'll add a new button where I say delete. And I want to do what this name implies. So of course I want to listen to a click and then, for example, trigger the delete friend method. And in this method, which we add in the friend contact.view file, in this method we now want to do what? Well, in the end we need to emit a custom event again, because the friends array is managed in app.view. And if we want to delete a friend, we need to delete it from this array, because it's this array which we're rendering with v4. So inside of friend contact, we basically just need to, you could say, forward the information that the user clicked the delete button here. So here we again just call this emit, $emit, with any event name of your choice, like delete. Now, if that is all you're doing, of course, you can also not use a separate method like this, though you absolutely can do it, nothing wrong with it, but you can also not do that and instead go to your template and just call emit in here, like this, and here without the this keyword, like always in the template. This is just an alternative, and it's up to you what you prefer. I'm doing both. For toggle favorite, I'm taking this extra method in which I call this emit. And for delete, I'm now not doing this, and I'm instead directly calling emit in the template. Nonetheless, you want to add this to your emits array to make it clear that this friend contact component has a delete event which will be emitted at some point. And now we can listen to this custom event on this friend contact component. So in the place where we are using that component. In this case, again, the app.view file. And in here, we can listen to the delete event with @delete on this component, and then point at a method that should handle this. Delete contact sounds like a fitting method name to me. So now in app.view, I'll add this delete contact method. And in here, I now want to remove that contact from my array. Now what's missing here? Well, some identification criteria, right? We need to know which contact should be deleted. So just as before, for toggling the favorite status, it would be good to get the ID of the friend that should be deleted. And therefore, also just as before, we can go to friendContact.view and pass this as a second argument to emit and forward the ID prop, which we are getting here. So refer to that here and pass it with delete. So now in app.view, here in delete contact, we now want to find the friend with that ID and delete him or her. And an elegant way of doing that in JavaScript, when you have an array and you want to delete an array based on some information you have about the item that should be removed, is you can override the array and assign a new value to this property that stores the array, so the friends property in this case, and use the old array but call the filter method on it. Filter is a method that's built into JavaScript which will return a new array based on the array on which you're calling it. And it will return the array on which you are calling it except for the elements you're filtering out. For that, filter wants a function which you provide as an argument. And if that function returns true, an element is kept around. If that function returns false, the element is deleted. It's a function which will receive the element as an input automatically by JavaScript. So this will run for every friend in Friends, and JavaScript will feed in every friend step by step. And we should return true if we want to keep the item or false otherwise. And this arrow function syntax is just a different way of writing a function in JavaScript, by the way. And here, I can therefore now check if the friend ID is not equal to the friend ID I'm getting here. I'm checking for non-equality because if it is equal, I want to keep it. So by checking for non-equality, I ensure that if the IDs are equal, I return false, because if they are equal, I want to remove that friend. And I mentioned that items are dropped if we return false here. So I want to return false if we find a matching ID. With that, we generate a brand new friends array, which is the old array minus the friend with this ID. And then we store that back into our friends data property. View will then detect this change in friends. It will see that friends changed. It will re-render that list and update the UI appropriately. So if we now save that, and I click on delete here on manual, you see manual is gone. And of course we can also delete Julie. If we reload, the data is back, because all of that is of course just happening in JavaScript and therefore in memory. But later we will also see how we can send such data to a server and store it permanently on a server-side database. But for the moment, this is a huge step forward because it shows us what we can do with components, and we got more practice with components now. Before we do anything else, it's time to practice what you learned so that you're really able to use those concepts and those things on your own. So here's another assignment for you. I got 3 tasks for you in this assignment, and they all build up on each other. In task number 1, you should add 2 components to this app. As a side note, you find this app, this starting project, attached to this assignment. Run npm install once you downloaded it, and then add your code and write your code in this project setup. So regarding the code you should write, there are two components you should add: an active user and a user data component. The active user component will be about outputting data. To be precise, it should output a username, maybe in an h2 tag, and an age, maybe in an h3 tag. The user data component should be about entering data. So the user of this web application should be able to enter data about the user we're managing in these components into that user data component. Because the user data component should contain two input fields in its template for the name and the age of the user. You can also add styling if you want to, but this is not required. It's not primarily about the styling here. And therefore, at the end of task 1, you should have two components with their templates. Active user outputs a username and age, and user data basically allows the user of this web app to enter values for name and age. At this stage, after task 1, these two components are not connected though. They're not talking to each other. In task number 2, I then want you to take the two components you created in task 1 and output them side by side in your main app template. And then in task number 3, we're going to connect everything. You should add and manage some user data and pick the right place, the right component for doing that, and ensure that it contains a name and an age. So you want to add some object data to your application that contains a name and an age. Now, the user data, so name and age, should then be output in the active user component, and it should be updatable with help of the user data component. So you will need to manage that data in the right place, in the right component, and then add all the functionality to provide that data to the active user component, and also to provide logic to, well, enable the user of your web application to update that data through the user data component. I hope these instructions are clear. As always, you find my solution after this video so that you can compare your solution to it. If possible, try it on your own first though, and then let's solve it together with my solution. So, did you succeed? Let's solve this together. In task number 1, we should create two new components. So I'll go to the source folder and create a components folder, and in there add an active user.view file and also the user data.view file. These are the two components we should create here: active user and user data. Active user will then be about outputting user data, so it will have a field for the username and the age, and user data, so this second component, will be about fetching user input, about letting the user of this web application enter data for name and age. Now let's start with active user maybe, and let's add a template there, and also our script area. And in the script area, I'll just export my config object. At the moment it's empty, because at the moment we don't need to add any logic yet. And in the template, I want to have a h2 and a h3 tag, and you could just enter those tags. I will actually wrap them with a section here. This is not mandatory though. And then in this section we have the h2 tag, where we will soon output the name of the user. For the moment, I'll just output my name, but that's going to change. And then also the age here, in my case 31 years. But this is also soon going to change. It will soon be dynamic. So that's the simple template here, and we can also add some styling here if we want to. Now I will do that. I will add some styling here, but only some basic styling, and I will ensure that my section here basically just has a margin of 2 rem and auto, so that it's centered, that it has a max width of, let's say, 40 rem, and I'll give it a border radius of 12 pixels, and add a border of 1 pixel solid and a light gray color. Side note, this will style all sections in your app, not just in this component. We will later learn how you can lock styling to a specific component, but at the moment, this will style all sections in all components, even though it is defined in this component. But I will come back to that styling later. So that's the very basic styling I will add here for now. And with that, I'll move on to user data. And there also add a template and a script section, of course. And just as before, in the script section, we can export an empty config object for the moment. And in the template here, I will also add a section. And as I just explained, this will therefore also get the styling defined in the other component, which is weird, I will admit that. But again, we'll dive deeper into styling components later. The more important thing here is that in this section, we want to have 2 input fields for the name and the age. So therefore here I'll add an input field of type text, which should get the username, and another input field also of type text. Let's say we could also use type number, but I'll go for text, which gets the age. I'll add some placeholders here to make it easier to identify the correct input field. Here I'll say your name, and here I will say your age. And of course, you can also add labels. You can also add styling here. I will keep this very, very simple here because I don't want to waste too much time on the styling. This is not a CSS course after all. I want to focus on the components and the component communication at this moment because that's what this assignment is all about. So now we got these 2 components, very basic components, but they have what they should have. And we added some basic styling as well. And with that, we're done with task 1. In task 2, we should output both side by side in the main app template. And that, of course, means, first of all, that we need a main app. At the moment, we got these components, but we got no main app where everything would start. So next to main.js, I'm going to add this app.view file, which will be our main app, where we then will start using our other components. Now, we create this main app just as we create all the components though, since, as you learned, components are just view apps, and therefore the main app is not configured in any different way. And we export our config object for the main app, and then here in the template, I want to use these 2 components. And for that, we first of all need to let Vue know about these components, right? That's important. We need to register those 2 components. Otherwise, we can't use them here. So let's go to main.js. And in there, we can import active user from /components active user.view. And also import user data from /components user data.view. So import those config objects and the templates, and however the Vue CLI combines them behind the scenes. And once they are imported, we can store our app in a constant here to make working with it a bit easier. And before we mount it, we can also call component and register our 2 components here. Now I'll name the first one active user. That will be my custom HTML tag, so to say. And I'll point at the active user config object here. And for the second component, we can use user data, for example, and point at user data. You should use multiple words combined with a dash here, as you learned, to make sure that your names here don't clash with built-in default HTML elements. So now we created those components and we made Vue aware of it. Now back in app.view, we can use them. I'll wrap them with a div here, though that's not something you have to use. But then more important, in that div, I'll have my active-user element, and I have my user data custom element, so to say. And if we saved it all, we can run npm run serve to start our development server and hopefully see something on the screen. So let's wait for that to start up. And I got an empty screen. And this makes a lot of sense because in main.js, I'm registering the components and everything. I'm using them here in app.view, but what am I not doing? Well, I'm not importing app view, and I'm not using that as my actual app. The actual app I'm creating here is still an empty object. Of course, here we want to use the app we're creating in the app.view file. After all, that's the app which has the template that uses those components. So it's this app which we should pass to create app. And with that done, if we save that, here's what we get. Now, okay, I will admit it, the styling is not super beautiful, but hey, it's about the components anyways. So we got our data here, we got the two input fields here, and now it's about connecting everything. Now, since it's super ugly, I'll tweak the styling a little bit. I will actually take that section here, this entire style block from ActiveUser.view, and add it to app.view. Since it's getting applied globally anyways, we can do it like this. Give that some padding, and also target the overall HTML element and set my font family to sans serif to make this a little bit nicer. Yeah, that's a little bit nicer. But now with that, we completed task number 2. So we're using both components. In task number 3, we should now ensure that we actually don't just have some dummy data, which we output here in ActiveUser, but that we manage some data which can be changed with help of the user data component later. And that, of course, starts with one important question. Where do we manage that user data? I mean, we have to manage it with help of the data property in some view config object, but which of our 3 apps do we use for that? Do we manage the user data in the ActiveUser component, in the user data component, or in our main app? Well, we could go for ActiveUser. That's where we need the data after all. But if we manage our data here, changing it from inside user data will be pretty hard since we have no easy way of communicating between those two components. So ActiveUser might not be the best component to manage our user data. Instead, we want to pick a component which has access to both components. So we want to pick our main app, because if we manage our user data there, we can tell it to change that data from inside user data by emitting a custom event here. And at the same time, we can pass the managed data down to ActiveUser. So our app.view file, our main app, has access to both components that interact with the user data. So we want to manage that data in such a place. So therefore, in app.view, in the config object here, we add our data option and return our data object here. And in there, we can now manage our user data. We could have a user field here, which is another nested object, and that user has a name, let's say, in my case, Maximilian Schwarzmuller, and it has an age, which is just a number. That could be our user data, which is managed here. And if we manage it here, we can pass it to ActiveUser with props. That's the idea behind props. We can configure a component from outside. So that means in ActiveUser, we now want to specify the props we're about to accept. And it's your component, so you can pick any prop names you want. And I'll accept a username and a user age prop. But you could also just go for age and name if you preferred that. You can also use the longer prop definition you learned about and provide this object form where you then define username in greater detail. And you make it clear that this is a string and that it's required, for example. And actually, I'll do that here, though if you just went with an array, so with that shorter form of defining props, that would also be okay for this assignment. But I'll go for the longer form here, make it clear that we have a string and a number type here, and that both are required. And with that, we can now pass data to these props, username and user age, on this component. So we can use these props like attributes on an HTML element. And we can set username to a certain value and user age to a certain value. And I will set username here to the name I'm storing in this user. Hence, we need to bind it to a dynamic value, since I want to refer to data managed in this view instance. And I will refer to user.name, so to this user data property, and then in there the name field. And we do pretty much the same for a user age. There we refer to user.age. And with that, we're passing data for these props to active user. And inside of active user, we can now refer to these props and output the prop data instead of the hard-coded values here. So with interpolation, we can refer to username, so to this prop, because you learned that these props are available just like data properties inside of this component. And we do the same here. I output user age years. And user age, of course, is that other prop we're getting. Of course, you have to use the exact names here in your template as you used for defining the props. And you, of course, also have to use exactly the same names for providing the data to that component. And now if we save that, we can see Maximilian Schwarzmüller and 31 years. But if we, for example, change this to Max Schwarzmüller here in our data in the app.view file, we see that this updates to Max Schwarzmüller. So passing down the values works. Now let's also hook up the user data component. There we got these input fields, and these input fields are there to allow the user of this web application to change the name and age we're managing here. So therefore, in the user data component, I will first of all add a button, set user data could be the caption of this button. And when we press this button, that data should be taken. So whatever the user entered up to this point will be taken. And that entered data should then be provided to app.view so that there we can update the stored user data. And then View will detect that this data changed, and the updated data will be provided to active user, and there the template will be updated, and hence the DOM will be updated and our changes will be reflected there. That's the idea, at least. So in user data, we got this button. I will actually wrap this all into a form, which is not mandatory though, but I'll do it here. And now we need to manage the entered data here in our user data component. So the data that's being entered into these inputs. Or alternatively, you could of course also use refs here for fetching what the user entered when the button is pressed. But I will do it old school, so to say, and I will store the entered data with every keystroke by managing two pieces of data in this component, the entered name, which is an empty string initially, and the entered age, which is an empty string initially. And we can then bind that with vmodel here to entered name, and on the second input, we bind this to entered age. So now whatever the user enters into those input fields will be stored with every keystroke into these fields down there. Of course, we now want to react to this form being submitted, which will happen when this button is pressed. So we can listen to the submit event here with @submit and use the prevent modifier to prevent this browser default of submitting the form and sending a HTTP request, which would lead to the page being reloaded. And then we can call a method of our choice, and I will call that method submit data, though that name, as always, is up to you. You just have to add it then to your methods configuration, add the submit data method to this config object here. And in submit data, we now want to do what? We now want to emit a custom event, because ultimately we want to let our main app know about the two pieces of data, the name and the age, that was entered by the user. So here I call this $emit to emit a custom event. And we now can pick any event name of our choice, for example, set-data. But again, this name is up to you. And this event will also carry some data. It should contain the entered name and age. So I'll forward this entered name and this entered age so that we can get that data in whichever place we're listening to that event, which will be the app.view file soon. I will also add the emits key here to make it clear which kind of events this component emits. And that's of course the set data event, which we will eventually emit. So now we're emitting that. We're fetching all the data, we're storing it, and then eventually when the button is pressed and the form is submitted, we emit the custom event with that entered data. And now in app.view, where we are using the user data component, we can listen to this custom event. We can listen to set data and then call any method of our choice here. So let's add a method in our main app config object. And that could be the set user data method. As always, those names are up to you. And it's that set user data method at which I want to point here. And now again, you will get some data here. You will get the entered name and the entered age. These two arguments are received in that custom method. So here we'll get the name and age. These two parameters, will get them because that's the data we're passing when the event is emitted. And therefore, inside of this method body, we can now reach out to our user and replace it with a new object, let's say. So reach out to this user, which we manage in our data. And on that new object, set the name to the name we receive here as a parameter and set the age to the received age. So we want to have the name and age fields because we had them before and because we're passing these fields down to active user. But now we set them to the new values we receive when this custom event is emitted. Well, and that should be all. If we now saved it all, we start with Max Schwarzmuller. But if I now enter Maximilian here and 32 and I click set user data, you see that updated. And of course, I can update this as often as I want. Now here's a little tweak we could do, which is not required as it works like before. You might notice that initially my age is a number here. And then here I'm fetching the entered age as a string, because if a user enters something into an input, it will always be a string. Even if what was entered is a number, it will be a number treated as a string then. And I'm emitting this as a string therefore, and then I'm using this as a string. So once we updated the data with help of set user data, age will no longer be a number but a string. Now that's not a technical problem in JavaScript, that works just fine. And since we're just using this number to output it in our active user component, that also doesn't have any negative consequences. But actually, we wanted a type number here on this prop, right? And therefore, if you open up the console log, indeed, you get a warning. Invalid prop, type check failed for user age, expected number, but got string. So whilst everything works, we technically don't have a perfect app here. We have a minor error. Of course, we could be fine with getting a string number here, because we're just outputting it anyways. We're not using it in a calculation, so it doesn't matter if it's a number or string. But if we do expect a number here, and you might have other components where this does matter, then we should do one thing. We should convert it. So here in app.view, when we store our age, when we set our new age, we should convert age to a number first, and we can simply do so by adding a plus in front of it. This will convert this string to a number, so to type number. And that's just a minor thing. We'll not see a difference on the screen, but we'll now get rid of that error. If I reload and clear the error log, if I now set a new value here, you see I get no warning anymore, because now we're working with the correct type of data. Again, it's a minor thing, but it is important to be aware of such things, also to avoid unexpected bugs which you might face in other applications. But with that, that's the assignment solved. You might have a different solution, does not mean that it's wrong, but hopefully my solution here helps you understand my thought process and helps you build Vue applications with components. I prepared another project for you, which you find attached. npm install and npm run serve brings it to your screen. And I did create this project for you so that we A, can again get a feeling for how components work together, and B, also see a little problem you will often face when you build bigger applications and you need to pass data around. But first of all, let's understand the project I'm providing to you here. So make sure you download and install it and start up that development server. And you should then see this on the screen. Now here, I got a very basic dummy application. We can select a topic if we want to learn more about the basics or components. And we can switch between those topics, and depending on what we choose, the content up there updates. Now that's definitely not too fancy, but it is about the code, not about what we see on the screen here. And the code is quite interesting. Here in app.view, in my main app, I'm rendering the active element component, and I'm rendering the knowledge base component. So this component. These two components here are getting used in the app.view file. Of course, all components are registered in main.js, so they are available to this entire Vue app. Now here's how this app works. Active element is quite straightforward. I got a topic title and a text. That data is then received as props, and in app.view, I'm providing these two props to active element based on the active topic. Now, what is active topic? That is some component internal data. So that's some data I'm managing in this app here, in this app.view file here in my data property. There I got an entire array of topics, but below that I got the active topic. Initially that's null, but when this method is triggered, and we'll see when this method is triggered in a second, then I set the active topic to one of these two topics I got in this array. Now, if active topic is null, thanks to this check I have here, we'll basically not pass anything relevant to topic title. But if it's not null, if we do have an active topic, then I provide the title and full text values to active element. Now, how is a topic set as an active topic? As I said, that happens with the activate topic method here. And in there, we receive a topic ID and use that ID to identify one of these two topics in this topics array. So when is the method getting triggered? Well, that happens on the knowledge base component. There I have the select topic custom event to which I'm listening. And when that event fires, activate topic is triggered. Please also note that I'm feeding the entire topics array as a value to the topics prop on the knowledge base component as well. So let's have a look at the knowledge base component then. In there, I'm getting this one topics prop, and I'm declaring that I'm eventually going to emit select topic. And here is where things get interesting and where we can see a little problem. I'm forwarding the topics to the knowledge grid, which I'm using here, and I'm basically also just forwarding select topic. I'm emitting it here in knowledge base, yes, but when do I emit it? Well, I emit it when knowledge grid emits select topic. So basically, knowledge base just acts as a pass-through component, you could say. I pass my topics through to knowledge grid, and I pass select topic, this event, through to app.view when it is emitted by knowledge grid. So knowledge base doesn't really have its own logic. Now, still, it's not unrealistic to have components like this, maybe because you have certain markup in there, which you want to contain in this component, maybe because you have certain styling. So having such pass-through components is absolutely not unrealistic and definitely something you will encounter in Vue apps. Now let's have a look at knowledge grid. In knowledge grid, I'm using topics. I'm also getting this as props and I'm using it there. So this is no longer a pass-through component. This needs and uses topics. But I also emit select topic here, and that is still being passed through basically, because ultimately it's the knowledge element. It's this component here which emits select topic when we click this button. So that's where this custom event is generated, the select topic event. And then both knowledge grid as well as knowledge base just forward that custom event to app.view in the end. So the event gets funneled through two components, and topics also gets funneled through at least one component, through the knowledge base onto knowledge grid. So everything here works, and that's also not a bad way of writing code, and it does hopefully again show you how props and events work and how you can connect everything. But we still are facing a problem here. We have the problem that we're having these unnecessary pass-through steps. I mean, it would be nice if knowledge base wouldn't have to deal with props and with emitting this event, because neither of the two is used or generated inside of this component. We're just using both to connect it to knowledge grid. And it turns out that Vue has a solution for problems like this.